Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another segment of Hollywood Memories. I'm Dan Roberts, the publisher of The Vegas Voice, and I have the fantastic pleasure of working with and sitting next to my favorite columnist and the other woman in my life, and that's Miss Beverly Washburn.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
You know what? We mentioned it previously. Let's do it again. You have been getting a ton of mail from people from not only across the country, from around the world. Where is that coming from?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for it. I'm very flattered and honored, but I don't know.
Yeah, but isn't it something that not only can you get mail from people not locally in the Las Vegas area, but literally across the country, from Florida, Minnesota, we're getting it. And now from around the world, Sweden, Germany.
It comes to the Vegas Voice.
Yeah. And again, if you're seeing this episode and you want to send Beverly, by all means, a letter, a fan mail request, whatever, please send it to us. Beverly always gets back to people. I know that for a fact. And then just let us know when you and where you see Beverly, so we can just kind of mark it for the future.
Okay.
Let's do something different again, as we do every time. And we're going to talk about not only the stars, but the producer and the directors that really shaped your life in the movies. And, I mean, you've been extremely fortunate that you've had all these people direct you, and I guess really they're fortunate to have you as a little girl doing stuff.
Well, I don't know how fortunate they were, but, the thing about it is I was so young that when I was directed by Cecil B. DeMille and George Stevens and Frank Capra, I didn't know who they were. I didn't appreciate it because I was too young. They were just nice men that I was working with, and it wasn't until I became older that I looked back on my career and realized how fortunate, how blessed I was.
Let's start with a director-producer, but in this case, he was the producer. That's Stanley Kramer. Right. And that was a May 1953 movie called The Juggler.
Right.
How did you...
Well, I had to audition for it. Yeah. So I got to read for Stanley Kramer, and I was lucky enough to get the role and starred Kirk Douglas. And so Stanley Kramer, just before I started filming, sent me this beautiful welcome letter saying, welcome to our movie, and I know you're going to be a wonderful little Susie in the role. And I cherished that letter.
I can imagine. And then in The Juggler, you worked with, and you've had scenes with the one and only Kirk Douglas.
I know. He was terrific. And then luckily, many, many years later, I did 3 episodes of Streets of San Francisco with Michael Douglas. So it was just so fun for me to be able to tell Michael that when I was 8 years old, I got to work with his dad. And Michael was wonderful and warm and welcoming, and he was terrific. And
when you worked with, let's say, Kirk Douglas, again, you had no idea who Kirk Douglas was. He could have been anybody off the street.
Right, at the time, because when you're 8 years old, I didn't even know what the word famous meant. To me, it was a job that I was doing, and I loved working, and so I just thought I was working with a nice man.
And he took good care of you.
It was terrific.
And what about Stanley Kramer? If you think back about him when he sent you the letter and you auditioned, were you nervous when you were auditioning?
No, I was too young to be nervous.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know. I was just excited about reading for a role because I had hoped that I would get the part, and luckily I did.
Oh, that was Stanley Kramer. Now let's talk about another director, and that is George Stevens. And you were in the April 1953 movie Shane, which is by all means a classic.
Yeah, I know. Again, I didn't know who George Stevens was, and it was fun. When you're a minor, you have to travel with either a parent or a guardian. So my mother and I went to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where most of the movie was filmed. Mm-hmm. And instead of putting us on a plane, for some reason, they had us go by train, which was really fun. So I worked on that for a couple of months, and most of it was filmed in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and then the rest of it was filmed on the lot at Paramount Studios.
And working with George Stevens or him as the director, how did you find his style or technique?
I was too young to even know like one from the other. Just I was, learned to take direction. If they would tell me what to do, I was taught to just do it. So I wasn't privy to styles or anything. All I knew is that if they told me what to do, that I needed to do it.
And when they would tell you, like a guy like George Stevens, would he be harsh? Would he be polite? Would he say, "Oh, now, Miss Beverly, can you do it this way?" Or, "Come on, get in the game"?
I played one of the Lewis children, Edgar Buchanan's daughter. So he would kind of talk to us, all at once. There were 4 of us, little girls, that played the children of Edgar Buchanan. So he would just kind of tell us, not individually, but just as a little collectively, like what he wanted us to do.
And again, it was starring Alan Ladd, and you worked with him. How was he? And I think you have a little story that is quite unique.
Do you have a story about Alan Ladd? I didn't know who Alan Ladd was until years later. I didn't get the connotation of being famous, but on a Sunday, we had the day off, so we all went up on the chairlift to go, up on this mountain. And coincidentally, Alan Ladd was in the chair behind me, and I was 8 years old. There's a picture of me in my book on the chair, and they didn't have like seat belts or anything. And anyway, we got up to the top, and Alan Ladd came right behind me, and he was afraid to go back.
He was afraid to go back down.
And it was just comical because, here he's this big macho Western star, and they had to send a helicopter for him.
No kidding.
And so the next day on the set, I was embarrassed because I was young, because the crew, they like to kind of rib, him and tease him. And they were teasing him about the fact that he was too chicken to go down the mountain. And they said at one point, well, little Beverly didn't have any problem. And of course, at the time, I was embarrassed, and I thought he would be upset with me or get mad at me or something. But he was so nice. He just came over and gave me a hug and smiled. So it turned out okay.
It turned out okay. One of the things is that you always mention that you worked with all these people, and they were nice, they were kind, they were considerate, you weren't nervous. But in the movie was Jack Torrance. Tell us a little bit about Jack. How intimidating was it?
Well, he was a bit intimidating because we were, just little girls.
Yeah.
I was 8 or so at the time, and there was one younger than I was. And he had that menacing look about him. So at first, we were a little bit frightened of him. But he was really, really nice and very sweet to all of us. So, once we knew that he was a nice man, and just because he looked that way, then it was fine.
So, like, the first time he came over to you and said, "Hey, Beverly, did you, back up a couple of steps?"
The 4 of us, we kind of, because he was kind of scary looking, but, he did those wonderful roles where he
was always the menacing, the bad guy.
And he did it very well.
And how would you rate him in terms of menacing, but let's say Sid Haig? I mean, they were both guys that people would always freeze, I guess, when they first saw him.
Yeah, well, with the Sid, I was an adult by the time I worked with him, and so it was just fun.
Just fun.
Yeah.
And ended up Jack being a very, very gentleman, a very nice guy.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was terrific.
But you didn't do anything to tick him off, though, I guess, huh?
No, we were a little intimidated at first, but in the end, he was terrific.
And working with George Stevens, as far as you can remember, how was that?
Fine. I, at the risk of being redundant, I did not know who he was. All I knew is that I had a job to do, and whatever he told me to do, I would need to do. And it wasn't until I became an adult and looked back over my career, and I thought, how cool is that to be directed by George Stevens?
Yes.
And,
well, let's talk about another director. You say, how cool. And that's Mr. Frank Capra, who was a legend. And you did something, you did the movie in September of 1951, Here Comes the Groom, with Bing Crosby and Jane Wyman. What was it like with Frank Capra?
Well, again, I did not know who he was, but he was terrific. And of course, when I went in to audition for the role, I got to meet him. And of course, my parents were over the moon, thinking that if I could only get this part, it would be amazing.
Yeah.
To be working with Bing Crosby and Jane Wyman and be directed by Frank Capra, but I didn't know who he was. But I worked on that film for 3 months. And it's a really cute film, I think, and it had a stellar cast. I mean, it had Bing Crosby, Jane Wyman, Franchot Tone, and then they had all these cameos with Louis Armstrong and Phil Harris and Cass Daly, and it was terrific. And then Edith Head was the costume. It was quite famous, and it won the Oscar that year for the best song, which was In the Cool, Cool Thrill of the Evening. written by Hoagie Carmichael and Johnny Mercer. And yet it was never a really well-known film.
Right.
It didn't do big box office for some reason.
And you mentioned your folks were that they knew who Bing Crosby
Oh,
was.
of course.
Did you know who he was?
Not at the time.
I mean, you had all these stars.
I know. I was too young to appreciate it. And, when you're 7 or 8 years old, you don't have the concept of who's famous or anything like that. So, but when we filmed, it was just one of my favorite experiences. And Bing Crosby gave me this beautiful doll.
Mm-hmm.
Jane Wyman gave me this beautiful dress. And Frank Capra gave me this adorable stuffed animal. And, when you're a kid, of course, presents are, kids like presents. And it was just a wonderful working experience.
The style between those three, before we get to the last gentleman, did you find it different, or was it all pretty similar? And it wasn't. Talk about it.
I was too young to, appreciate styles or whatever. All I knew is that I had to do what they told me to do. And they were always, being a child, you would kind of expect them to be nice to a child, and they all were.
They all were.
Yeah.
You never had a problem with them.
No, they were all wonderful, and I feel so fortunate.
All right, let's talk about another, again, a legend, a director, and that is Cecil B. DeMille. And you did a movie called The Greatest Show on Earth. This was back in 1952, and it was directed by the Cecil B. DeMille. Mm-hmm. Anything of significance? Because, again, if I understand this correctly, you have a scene with
Jimmy Stewart.
Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
And, between Jimmy Stewart, a legend, and Cecil B. DeMille, another legend, nothing fazed you on it.
Well, it didn't mean anything to me because I didn't know who they were, and I didn't get the concept of famous or anything like that. All I knew is that I was on the set, and we were supposed to be under the big top at the surface.
Right.
And Jimmy Stewart was in the clown, and I'm in the stands, and we have this little conversation, and he gives me a little balloon. And so for me, it was just fun. I wasn't saying, oh, I'm working with Jimmy Stewart or being directed by Cecil B. DeMille, because I didn't.
I mean, you weren't that impressed. It was just a job to do, no more, no less.
But later, when I became an adult, and then I realized, and even to this day, I feel very fortunate to have been directed by true legends.
And when you did the scene with Jimmy Stewart, was your mom on the set, do you recall it?
Yes.
Was she impressed with the fact that Jimmy, she knew who Jimmy Stewart was. She knew who the director was.
As a minor, you have to have either a parent or a guardian on the set. But there was an incident that
Talk about the incident, because that's one of my favorite stories you told me over the years, especially with the cast and the director being Cecil B. DeMille.
Right. Well, we all know that the director's job is to direct, and they're the ones that will say action to get the film, the scene going.
They're in charge of everything.
Right.
Go ahead.
And then when it's over with, they say cut. So we were doing the little scene, and all of a sudden this woman in the background just yelled out really loud, cut. And of course, everybody just froze. And I was too young. I didn't know what all the commotion was about. But it turned out, that old adage about Hollywood stage mothers, she was the mother of one of the little boys that was an extra that was in the stands behind us. And she thought that he wasn't being seen on the camera.
And she just...
So she yelled, oh, cut. And then, of course, there's all this commotion, and I didn't learn about it till later, exactly what happened. I didn't understand. But anyway, it was because she thought that her son wasn't being seen on camera. So, of course, they immediately marched her and her son off the set, which is kind of sad because I doubt
he never worked again, did he? No. But, the idea that a stage mother would do that, your mom would never do that.
No, my mom was the best.
She was good like that, huh?
Really sweet, and always would just stay, behind the scenes.
And it just shows what a remarkable career you have. No matter how I kid with you and talk to you, you have absolute legends, and you worked with them. Well, they should be fortunate. They worked with you as a little girl like this. You look back on your career, you're just stunned by all this. So you shows you how lucky I am and how fortunate I am to be with you, and you put up with me. So I thank you so much, as always. Keep those cards and letters coming to Miss Beverly. And this is Dan Roberts with Miss Beverly Washburn saying we'll see you again next time. As always.
Thank
you,
everybody.